Welcome to the week number 8 overview for economic analysis of the law here at Rutgers University in Camden. And in this week, the majority of your time is going to be spent on Chapter 8, an economic theory of contract law. There's also a little bit on Chapter 9, but I'll include that in the video for next week's overview. In particular, make sure you regain some familiarity with game theory that we discussed in that first or the second chapter of the course. It's important that you understand the tenets of game theory in this chapter, so it'd probably be a good idea to make sure you understand that. A central theme of this chapter is the extent to which the law can help to solve the coordination problem between potential contracting parties. They may want to make mutually beneficial promises that bind themselves to certain actions and induce reliance by the other party. But in the absence of an inexpensive method of allowing parties to make a credible commitment, it may not be easy to achieve this commitment and reliance. Another important theme of this chapter is that the law can assist parties to form these consensual agreements by providing a set of default and mandatory rules that greatly reduce the cost of achieving an agreement. This distinction between default rules and mandatory rules is very useful, so make sure you understand the difference between a default and a mandatory rule. When you come to examine the set of rules that constitute contract law, be sure to understand if each of them is a default rule or a mandatory rule. Note that there are two general kinds of default rules, majoritarian and penalty. Majoritarian are the starting points that most people would want. By denominating those as the default rules, the law saves most people the cost of changing to something more desirable. Rather, the minority who prefer some other arrangement to that of the default rule will have to incur the cost of contracting around the default. A penalty default is a default rule that will, unless changed, impose a penalty on one of the parties if he or she withholds pertinent information. Mandatory rules may not be changed even by mutual consent. A principal justification for this is paternalism. A good example of a potential problem that mandatory rules create is the mandatory rule that, in almost all cases, minor children cannot make a binding contractual promise. That means that not even a competent minor can waive this rule. One last thing to bear in mind. Efficiency in contract law requires efficiency at 3 different stages of the contractual relationship. At the time the agreement is formed, during the time between formation and performance when the parties need to rely upon one another, and finally, at the time the parties must choose to perform or breach. So make sure you realize that. It's a very important part of this chapter. Also realize this notion of third-party effects. Third-party effects are sometimes at issue when a commercial contract threatens to harm a business rival of one of the parties to the contract. Such a rival may be led to take action interfering with the performance of the contract. Such actions are often discussed under the doctrine of inducement to breach. Third-party effects of this sort also form part of what is known as an economic tort.